Good afternoon. My name is Mandy Lewis, and I'm a Vice Consul at the U.S. Consulate General in Chennai. I welcome you all to this evening's session on multi-layered marginality, understanding exclusion in COVID-19 times. This event is one of many virtual events brought to you by the U.S. Consulate General and the United States India Educational Foundation in Chennai. I am happy to welcome our guests, Dr. Indira Ramarao and Dr. Sudeshna Mukherjee, who will share their insights on how COVID-19 and gender identity have impacted four already vulnerable groups in India: people with disabilities, members of the LGBTQ community, the elderly, and sex workers. These are challenging times around the world, and as social distancing has become the new normal, there is an increased danger of greater social exclusion for the most vulnerable. In both India and the United States, the concept of marginality has recently received a lot of attention. And in the face of the global coronavirus pandemic, three things have become clear. First, some already marginalized groups have a disproportionately high risk of becoming seriously ill, hospitalized, and even dying of COVID-19. In the United States, according to the CDC, health differences between racial and ethnic groups result from inequities in living, working, health, and social conditions that have persisted across generations. In public health emergencies, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, these conditions can also isolate people from the resources they need to prepare for and respond to outbreaks. Secondly, the effects of the pandemic disproportionately have harmed women. According to the United Nations, across every sphere, from health to the economy, security to social protection, the impacts of COVID-19 are exacerbated for women and girls simply by virtue of their sex. Finally, any association with COVID-19, from those actually infected to those charged with caring for COVID-19 patients, has led to stigmatization. To combat this social stigmatization in India, USAID has recently partnered with the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare to assist the government of India in a national awareness campaign against discrimination and stigma faced by healthcare workers, individuals in quarantine, and their families. The more we talk about it, the more we stand up against discrimination, the better off everyone will be. So today, as I said, we are very lucky to have two guests who will talk to us about the impact of COVID-19 on four historically marginalized groups: people with disabilities, members of the LGBTQ community, the elderly, and sex workers. Before I invite Dr. Indira Ramarao to present, I would like to let you know that we will be having a question and answer session at the end of our discussions. So please type your questions into the chat box on your screen, and we will have our guests address as many of your questions as we can. Let me start by introducing the first speaker for today, Dr. Indira Ramarao. Professor Indira Ramarao is a former professor and chairperson of the Department of Sociology and director of the International Center at the University of Mysore. She is a recipient of two Fulbright fellowships: the Fulbright Postdoctoral Fellowship at Purdue University, Indiana in 1991 to 1992, and the Fulbright Visiting Lecturer Fellowship at the University of Iowa in 2011 to 2012. She is also a visiting faculty at Study India programs of the University of Puget Sound, Iowa, Delaware, Princeton, Michigan, Cornell, and Florida International University. Apart from authoring several books and articles in journals, both in English and Kannada, Dr. Indira has also served the Indian Sociological Society, both as president and secretary. Our second speaker for today is Dr. Sudeshna Mukherjee, associate professor in the Center for Women's Studies at Bangalore University. Dr. Mukherjee has a doctoral degree in sociology and gender studies from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Dr. Mukherjee is the recipient of the Bureau of Police Research and Development, Government of India Fellowship in 2011 for her doctoral work. She has published 2 books and contributed more than 30 articles in national and international journals. In 2015, she was nominated to the International Visitor Leadership Program funded by the US Department of State on the fight against gender-based violence. Dr. Sudeshna was appointed as a member coordinator for the drafting committee of the Women's Empowerment Policy for the Government of Karnataka in 2016. Thank you, Dr. Indira and Dr. Sudeshna, for joining us. So Dr. Indira, I will start with you. Could you start by telling us what is meant by multi-layered marginality, and what is the nature of the marginality experienced by people with disabilities and members of the LGBTQ community? And then, Dr. Sudeshna, if you could talk about the impact on the elderly and sex workers. Over to you, Dr. Indira. Dr. Indira, if you could just unmute yourself so we can all hear you.
Sorry, good afternoon. Thank you. Good afternoon to everybody. We thank the US Consulate General Chennai and the United States India Educational Foundation for this opportunity. Before I begin my presentation related to marginality and then move on to discussing the situations of the disabled and the LGBT community, before I hand it over to Sudeshna, I want to start by remembering with gratitude the first lessons that I learned in looking at gender from a holistic perspective from my faculty mentors when I was at Purdue University on a postdoctoral fellowship in 91-92, that is nearly 30 years ago. Since then, my Fulbright experiences have stayed with me, enriched my understanding, and gave me the opportunity to connect and interact with an international stakeholder community, and gave me insights which have enriched my academic career. And so I want to thank the entire Fulbright process for this opportunity. Now I just move to the discussion in brief of what constitutes marginality. Well, marginality is the product of an unequal society, because this society in which we live, and for that matter all societies, are hierarchical in nature, and people are placed in different strata in this hierarchy. So marginality expresses itself in multiple ways, which include unequal access to society's resources, disparate life chances, lack of opportunities for taking decisions about how the people in the margins want to lead their lives in the present and in future, and of course, the lack of opportunities for achieving what sociologists have called upward personal and social mobility. Well, the next slide, please. The marginality situation denotes vulnerability. Now, vulnerability is a condition where people are not in a position to translate their rights into entitlements. Marginality is a situation that is caused by a multiplicity of factors such as age, gender, physical condition, sexual choice, economic condition, location, and of course, as I said, the absence of freedom to make choices. And I'm just naming a few indicators of marginality. There are many more. Each of these indicators of marginality in itself renders the person susceptible. And when they intersect with each other, the marginality levels are magnified. And marginality also indicates two things. One is dependence, the other is deprivation. And dependence and deprivation, they reinforce each other and create a condition called exclusion. Now, social exclusion, again, is a feeling, is a reality experienced by many people in all societies. And this happens because marginality can either be inherited or it can be acquired. Just to give an example, physical conditions and problems related to a person's health, for that matter, they can be passed on from one generation to the other. Often people experience marginality because they are placed in situations in their life over which they have no control. But many of the conditions of marginality are acquired because people are not able to live in a sound and safe ambience, get opportunities to get formal education, safe and affordable healthcare, and of course, jobs that give them what I would call social and economic power to lead dignified and relatively comfortable lives. And so the marginalized lack both economic and political power. Their voices are generally not heard, and their lives' realities are generally not visible. And gender, coming now to gender, why do we need to look at marginality from a gender lens? See, gender is one type of marginality that crosses the barriers of ethnicity, economic conditions, physical conditions, and social conditions. Now, gender identities place people in a situation of what is called double discrimination. It is not that poverty, marginalization, economic hardships are faced only by women or sexual minorities. However, given the operation of patriarchy and male hegemony in our society, women tend to suffer the onslaught of any calamity, whether natural or human-induced, with greater severity than others. And that is why, we need to discuss the COVID pandemic in the context of gender. Now, in this background, I will talk about the situations of the disabled, and then the LGBT community, and then invite Sudeshna to talk about the other two most marginalized groups, the elderly and sex workers. In fact, there has been a lot of talk, ever since the pandemic hit us, as to why there is need to discuss the impact in the context of gender and certain groups. But the answer is obvious, because those who already are suffering from certain vulnerabilities, those people in whose lives certain deprivations are inherent because of the conditions I mentioned, there is need to discuss their situations, because they not only have to impact policy, but also enhance our understanding of many groups in our society that are facing greater problems than those whom I call are placed in comfort zones. Now, talking of disability, kindly move on to the slide on disability, please. Disability can be physical, can be mental. It can be described as a situation which hinders the normal functioning of the body and mind. Of course, we may all be aware of the fact that the type of disability and the intensity of that disability may differ from one person to the other. While some forms of disability do not render those suffering from it completely immobile or completely dependent. There are other forms of disability that make them completely dependent either on institutional care or on home care. And this is an area where, you know, we need to pay some attention when we talk of disability vis-a-vis the pandemic. And the circumstances in which disability has placed people in general and women in particular needs to be focused at. Now in India, it is said that people with disabilities constitute about 2.21% of the population. And the need to talk about disability in the context of gender is justified when we see that 45% of the disabled are women. And so when we talk of women, it, you know, kind of fits into a situation called double discrimination, because we know that studies have shown us that among the poor, women are the poorest. Among the hungry, women are the most hungry. And among the exploited, among those who suffer violence both in terms of physical abuse as well as denial of resources of the family, the neighborhood, and society at large, women definitely are more in number. So when the pandemic happened, the disabled suffered a great deal because lockdown disrupted flow of information, basically by restricting their mobility. And their social networks were completely cut off. Now the cutting off of social networks has happened to everybody in some way or the other. But for those who could manage their lives, for those, you know, who could take care of their needs without any support, at least it was manageable. But given the conditions of those who are disabled, also coupled with poverty, also coupled with deprivation and dependence, and their dependence on delivery of services of food and other essentials, and the lockdown cutting off those connections, the disabled suffer more. And when you talk of the disabled women in India, a large number of them in rural areas depended on community support and, you know, the remittances from their families that had migrated to cities or bigger metros for earning their livelihoods. But with markets closing down, with the informal sector being the hardest hit, and with large-scale interstate migration happening, remittances to the families back in their villages stopped. And the group that came to be affected most were women. In fact, studies have shown that due to lack of disaggregated data on disability and gender, it's always difficult to point out the nature of the impact in quantitative terms. However, it's an established fact that during the pandemic, women with disability suffered more than men with disability and also other groups. And when talking of gender, we have to talk of girl children. The closure of schools for girls or disabled children and hostels where their basic needs were taken care of led to a situation of what is now being called forced dropout. So when they came back to their families, they had no food, and the support that they got in schools, you know, in terms of counseling, in terms of relaxation, everything was gone. And another very scary development in a negative sense that has happened is this concept of shadow pandemic has hit the disabled more than anybody else, because in the families, in the form of domestic violence, let loose by their own families, the young and adolescent girls in particular are suffering. So before I move on to the LGBT, I want to say one thing, that the shadow pandemic, as it is called, the invisible, unheard pandemic, has impacted the safety of young girls, adolescent girls. Many times, adolescent girls who are left home because of the situation of disability, were exposed to sexual abuse in their own neighborhood. Now they are with their families. Community violence may have reduced a little bit, but violence within the family has intensified. And also, those who were in employment lost their jobs. Even otherwise, women are the last to be hired, first to be fired. So it was very easy to throw them out of jobs. So disability interspersed with gender, disability interspersed with helplessness, disability interspersed with the situations created by the pandemic. And so this is something that needs to be looked at. And before I close, I would like to move on to the LGBT community. Kindly go to the next slide, please. The LGBTQ plus community already suffers from a social stigma. In fact, there is a new word that has now got into COVID terminology called the super spreaders. They already suffered from social and physical isolation. Now there is a kind of a xenophobia-like situation in their own families and communities. Every day we keep reading about members of the community being thrown out of their families or not allowed to enter into their villages because there is a kind of an inbuilt hatred, an inbuilt prejudice. In fact, the cutting off of networks, as I said, the lockdown imposed ban on movement took away the anonymity from many of the members of the LGBT community who were trying to hide their sexual identities. And now when their families have come to know about this, studies are now showing that when the family came to know that the youngster is a member of this community, because this is a society where heterosexuality is the accepted norm and anything other than that, sexual choice is still not recognized. And so with cuts in transport, with transports blockade, with all the markets closed, with all the cultural events that were happening where especially the Hijra community's presence was required, their sources of livelihood have been completely cut off. And the last thing I want to say before I close this is that their access to health social security benefits is severely affected. This has happened, COVID or no COVID, because of the prejudice, that people harbor in their mind and treat them as if they are a category unto themselves. That's why I said they already suffered from social and physical isolation. So these are the two groups, the people with disability and the LGBT community, that need to be focused more in our policies. And the state and civil society need to come in to include them in their action, in their discourse. So I'll stop here and leave the floor for Sudeshna. Sudeshna, please.
Thank you, Professor Indira. And thank you, Mandy, and very good afternoon to all our viewers. So a pandemic situation like COVID has impacted everybody, but it brought unspeakable misery for some hitherto invisible people living in margins with multiple vulnerabilities, and their pre-existing vulnerabilities have further intensified due to COVID. We have heard about two such groups from Professor Indira, and now I will focus your attention on the exclusion and marginality experienced by our elderly population, especially women elders. Ageism, that is the discriminatory attitude towards people of more advanced age, may have significantly contributed to the detrimental effects on health and longevity of the older adults with COVID-19. According to the last census, senior citizens make up about 9% of India's population. 9% doesn't seems big, but considering the absolute number of population of India, it is a huge number. COVID-19 disease in itself has hit older adults harder than any other age groups. Globally, more than half of all the deaths occurred in people of 80 years plus. A study by the researchers attached to the International Institute of Population Sciences, Mumbai, has found that in India, 36.8% of the COVID deaths are in the 65 plus age group. Elderlies are vulnerable due to their comorbidities like weaker immune response, pre-existing cardiovascular disease, diabetes, or respiratory illness, which raises the risk of severe COVID-19 and related death. While studies have shown that globally men are more prone to dying from COVID-19 than women, in India, the case fatality rate, which we term it as CFR, among men is 2.9%, while for women it is 3.3%, to show the gender differential health access in a patriarchal society, which Professor Indira was talking about, and more exclusion and marginalization for the women elderlies. The elders, especially those who are 80 and above, they are facing one more exclusionary process and became victim of official or unofficial medical triaging protocols of different countries. Compared to the other seasonal flu, COVID-19 patients' higher requirements for ventilator led to a shortage of ventilators and intensive care resources, resulting in limited medical care and death even in medically advanced countries. However, a new marginalization is created through new triaging protocols where elders are not a priority. Not only COVID, for other medical purposes also, elders are not getting required attention in any medical setup, which adversely compromising their quality of life. And if you see that caste, class, and gender location of an individual, that adds further layers in their further marginalization in accessing health. I give you a small example. Think about a tribal woman who is living, who is in an impoverished condition, living in a deep down in the forest, who has got some kind of a disabilities, maybe age-related or maybe by birth, and she is an 80 plus years and she is COVID positive. Think about her accessing the health benefits. So see the layers of marginality she is experienced. So the old age dependency ratio is very high in India, that is around 14.2% based on 2011 census. Nearly half of our seniors, around 53 million, are living in abysmal economic conditions. More than 67% of women elders are entirely dependent on others for their living. In India, when we come to care, institutional care is often prohibitively costly and out of bound for the majority of our population. In the absence of well-defined state-supported social securities, elders are often cared for by family members or left alone with unmet needs. However, in a pandemic situation, institutional care is also not always a very successful intervention. As we see in many developed countries, including US and Canada, a significant number of COVID deaths took place in care homes due to non-availability of caregivers and other constraints. And when we come to the family care in India, with the changing family structure towards more nuclearization of families, rural-urban migration, and joining of women in the productive labor force, opened manifold care challenges before Indian families. Women are generally caregivers in the families, and when caregivers herself in need of care and dependent on others for a living, the situations become critical. Therefore, in India, we have to support our time-tested home care with affordable daycare, institutional care, and more professionally trained geriatric caregivers and volunteers. Yes, volunteers. This practice of volunteers, which I noticed in US during my gender training program, is worth emulating in our country. We have a significant number of young population and we need to involve them in the process. The challenge of exclusion increases manifold for the people living with dementia and Alzheimer's. Now I am coming to another excluded community within the elders. So those who are suffering from dementia and Alzheimer's and similar forms of cognitive impairment, terminal health conditions, and issues with mental health. One of the specific challenges they face is that they may have difficulties in understanding the dangers of infection. Also, they may forget to follow the safety precautions, such as washing their hands or practicing physical distancing. If family members who care for such persons, They have contacted with the virus, they find further difficulties in arranging the alternative care, which is very difficult to arrange in this time of pandemic. So we see that these are adding to the layers in their marginality and the problems. Then we see that another issue, a very challenging dominant issue, that is the issue of loneliness. HelpAge India estimates that around 10 to 20% of the seniors in India are suffering from loneliness. Pandemic-induced lockdown, quarantine, and social distancing measures heightened the agony of the elder persons suffering from isolation and neglect, and many of them went into deep depression. Pandemics are typical situations in which people's life may seem out of control. A study by Agewell India Foundation revealed that 71% of the senior citizens are facing harassment, humiliation, and physical violence by the family members, children, and the relatives. The shadow pandemic Professor Indira was talking about. During COVID, dwindling income, high dependency, costly and unpredictable healthcare further builds up stress, which could trigger more abuse. Those who are in a debilitating condition like dementia and other age-related disabilities also face harassment from the professional caregivers. In one of my studies I have come across during the pandemic only, in one elderly woman who was partially paralyzed, due to the lockdown situation, she had to depend on a male caregivers, and she was sexually abused too. Yes, you are hearing me rightly. Even the elderly people are sexually abused. Many a time, the family gives a blind eye to such kind of aberration for an apparent reasons. Pandemic has increased our reliance on the technology in terms of connecting with facilities, banking, procuring necessities, and bridging the physical distances above all. Nevertheless, the majority of our elders are they are either technologically challenged or not in a position to afford, or both. So this technological divide is costing them dearly. Pandemic demands recognition of need of the elders as essential. This is to bring to your notice that at least in Karnataka, the person with disability and elderly, they are entitled to, those who are on the below poverty line, they are entitled to the government pension. For the last 5 months, Social Welfare Department, they have not released their pensions because of the fund crunches. And this was the time when they needed most. So the time has come that we must consider that their needs are also the essential needs amidst the pandemic. Thus, apart from state, we need more voluntary interventions from family and community to minimize the exclusion and marginalization of our elders amidst a deadly pandemic. Now I focus your attention to the next marginalized group, that is sex workers. Based on a survey conducted in 2016, UNAIDS conservatively estimated that there are more than 6.5 lakh sex workers in the country. It is a conservative estimate. The unofficial figures place these numbers far higher. It could be over 8 lakhs. Survey shows that there are an estimated 1.22 million children are involved in sex work as well. So I'm just giving you this data to make you aware of the gravity of the situation. The decriminalization of sex work is a prerequisite to ensure the physical and emotional well-being of sex workers. Indian law lies in a gray zone where sex work is not a criminal offense, but soliciting is. Sex workers' right to life, right to freedom of labor, right to health, right to reproductive and sexual rights are all buried under the quagmire of social stigma. Sex workers' precarious economic condition, exposure to violence, multiple health challenges, uncertain legal status, and social stigma attached to their profession make them invisible and marginalize them as citizens. Sex workers' livelihood is hard hit due to COVID-19 conditions. The community of sex workers are like any other daily wagers, with hardly any client visiting them due to corona-induced lockdown and social distancing norms. They are going through a harrowing time. A Yale School of Medicine and Harvard Medical School study showed that if the red light areas started operating the disease would spread extremely fast and infect a very high percentage of sex workers and their customers. According to National AIDS Control Organization of India, NACO, on a conservative estimate, over 5 lakh customers visit different red light areas daily. Sex workers can be, now we have to see that there are different categories of sex workers and the disease impacted them differently. Sex workers can be broadly classified as in the first category, that is brothel based, that is those who operate from the red light areas like Sonagachi in Kolkata, GB Road in Delhi and Kamathipura in Mumbai. The business undoubtedly affected, but they are supporting each other through the solidarity groups, and they can be reached by governmental agencies and civil society organizations working with them for relief. In Kamathipura, Mumbai, the Kranti or Durbar in Sonagachi, they are providing the food rations. They are collecting the cooked food as a donation for the sex workers and their families. So they are somehow managing. The second category is a flying or street-based sex workers who are worse affected. They come from the nearby districts and suburbs to the city and go back. The majority of the sex workers in Bangalore are under this category, and they are the worst hit during pandemic as they cannot be identified for help. And even if they're identified, the identification will attract more misery and further exclusion. Then we have the third category who are the house-based, hotel-based, massage parlor-based sex workers who work under disguise and generally work under an employer. So meeting the survival need of these groups was the employer's responsibility. Wherever possible, employers sent them back and they had those experiences and endured all the pain which other migrant laborers faced to reach their home. So now we see that another new category, like some of the sex workers are using digital media to solicit their clients. So sex workers are redefining their profession through mobile sex, sex chat, and reorienting themselves to stay afloat for themselves and children. However, the digital divide is hitting them hard as well. Neither all of them have access to smartphone, nor they are well versed with the new media and modes of digital payment. Many of them do not have the proficiency to run their profession virtually. So the entire community is facing severe repercussions due to halt in their income. With little or no money left, the availability of food becomes meager. Many sex workers are HIV positive or tuberculosis patients who struggle to generate enough income to balance between food and medicines. Some even have families in villages who rely on them for regular financial support. They do not know how they will pursue education of their children, and that may adversely impact the girl children, resulting in child marriage. Already some studies in Maharashtra showing that child marriages are rising. Trafficking or forced induction into the mother's profession. In Mumbai's Kamathipura area, those who failed to pay rent were kicked out of their houses. They had no option but to live on the footpaths. Sex workers are more vulnerable to contact the deadly pathogen given their unhygienic living conditions. In some areas, 25 to 30 people are crammed in one room of a multi-story building, sharing a common toilet. It is unlikely that their occupation will resume post-lockdown since the nature of their job wholly violates the norms of social distancing. On my interaction with an organization who works for the sex workers in Bangalore, one of them commented that we could fight AIDS pandemic with condoms, but COVID is more disastrous as we cannot run our profession by wearing a raincoat. They wanted to mean the PPE. Before COVID could catch us, we all will die out of starvation. That's the reality. With their sustenance at stake, sex workers are now forced to depend on the government for aid. Reportedly, under Prime Minister's Garib Kalyan Yojana, a financial package of 500 rupees per month and approximately $6.5 would be transferred to the poor woman's account under the Jan Dhan Yojana for 3 months. However, most of these women sex workers do not have a Jan Dhan account, or the absence of required documents disqualifies their chances of acquiring one. This pandemic, if we see overall, really caught us unprepared, both as a democratic state and a civil society. We suffered because as a nation, we have failed to bridge widening inequality. Our gross underspending on public health and targeted social security benefits over the years costed us dearly. This is the time for introspection and to prepare our capabilities to counter future challenges more effectively and with dignity for our fellow citizens living amidst extreme vulnerabilities. We need to gear up for, next slide please, the collection of disaggregated data for, excuse me, for each of the 4 groups and experiential analysis through the micro studies. We have to revisit the existing policy framework and social security measures for these groups from a gender lens and intersectional perspective to reflect on their multi-layered marginality, which was beautifully explained by Professor Indira. So we also have to understand the need of the underprivileged, and it needs to be recognized as an essential service. That is the urgent need of the time. Bridging the technological divide, because now in the pandemic situation, we are finding that technology is a big savior. So we have to bridge the technological divide through the dissemination of technoliteracy and affordable access to technology. We have to build up a robust and affordable public health care for all citizens, and we have to gear up our investment at least 6% of our GDP on health, and this is absolutely a priority. Proactive civil society intervention for responsive and responsible community action through voluntary participation, we can face the future challenges. Thank you, and I'm handing over to Mandy.
Thank you, Dr. Sudeshna, for sharing that. That was a lot of really valuable information. We're getting some questions in, but Dr. Indira, before I move on to specific questions, I wanted to invite you to see if you have any final thoughts you would like to share.
Well, all I have to say is, in explaining gender, we'll have to have an inclusive approach that we include the sex workers, the LGBT community, and women among the disabled and the elderly. Now, often, it is assumed that women are a homogeneous category, that gender means only men and women, and we cannot have that approach. The next action about rebuilding the lives, I think that's what has to happen next in this country and elsewhere across the world. So we'll have to make the concept of gender itself inclusive, and both in our, I would say, academic as well as activist discourses, we have to include, these women who are suffering the vulnerability much more than other groups. So I wouldn't say that the state, is only responsible. The state, what I would expect is strengthen social security, build up the institutions that are dealing with problems that the groups are facing, and more importantly, I would say that there should be civil society intervention at the level of the street, at the level of the community, and at the level of the city, village, nation as a whole. So whatever resources those who can afford have must be shared, whether it is in terms of infrastructure, whether it is in terms of knowledge, or whether it is in terms of sharing whatever they have. So this is all that I've got to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Indira. Dr. Sudeshna, I have a question.
Yeah, thank you, Mandy. I just would like to emphasize on 4 C's. That is 4C, like care, we need compassion, care, communication, and cooperation. That as a society, we have to emphasize on this 4 C's to make a society an inclusive society and address the issues of exclusion and marginalities. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sudeshna. And I do have a question that's come in, and I'd like to put it to you first, Dr. Sudeshna. You talked a little bit about different approaches in other countries. For example, institutionalized care that is common in the United States or Canada, Great Britain for the elderly, and how that came with some pitfalls and we saw spreading through those institutionalized settings. Yet you also mentioned some of the problems in India where it's more common for an elderly family member to be at home. When you're looking at countries around the world, first, a very general question, are there any countries where you don't see marginality as an issue? And then also as a follow-up, are there countries you look to as a model for how they are doing a good job caring for marginalized groups?
Thank you, Mandy. But if you see that gender is an universal issue, I mean, the discriminatory practice of gender, it is there in all the countries in a irrespective, I mean, different degrees. So some of the Scandinavian countries are doing well, but still, again, we can see that the COVID deaths in the care homes are very high in those countries as well. So, I mean, elders, especially, I mean, they are vulnerable due to various other parameters. So that was definitely there. And the care challenges within the families, that is also we have addressed. So we have to somewhere we have to balance in between. So it is not that institutional care I am totally denouncing, but institutional care has its own challenges because we have seen that caregivers, they were not available, or maybe they got affected, they got admitted. So we have to have that's why in the end, last I told that this pandemic got all of us unaware, unprepared. So now we have to think about, when we are thinking about the policy, we have to think about these backup plans. When such situations happen, how we can manage this institutional care and home care. Both has its advantages and disadvantages. So we have to, I mean, the country will, I mean, obviously adopt what suits the country best. So there cannot be, I mean, uniform suggestions for all the countries.
Thank you, Dr. Sudeshna. Dr. Indira, a question has come in. It says that hospitals in general do not consider insurance and to admit patients. They want patients to deposit a lot of money as an advance before people can be admitted to the hospital. Has this had an impact on marginalized groups, making certain groups more marginalized? What is your view on this practice and how much of an impact do you think it has had?
Well, hospitals, again, are not a homogeneous category, you know, here. One thing that has happened in India after globalization started is public spending, as Sudeshna said, on health and education also has enormously reduced. And according to some estimated figures, 40% of the healthcare is with private healthcare sector. So about insurance, my basic question would be, how many among the marginalized have access to insurance in the first place? You see, there have been studies on what are called out-of-pocket expenses on healthcare that have been carried out in different parts of the country, which have shown that because of lack of access to healthcare, more and more people from rural poor families are forced to pay money to get healthcare. And given the fact that many of the primary health centers in rural areas where, you know, a large number of the marginalized live, do not have those facilities, a situation has come about in a large number of cases where private healthcare becomes the only choice. So most of them do not have medical insurance, and hence the question of using insurance to go to hospital, I think doesn't apply to many of them. Yes, I agree that in many hospitals, you know, they make it a very cumbersome process to take your insurance even if you have one. So they would put conditions and say, deposit the money first and then we will see. So it cannot be one definite answer that will be applicable to all groups. But for the marginalized, I say that, you know, there is in fact a concept called lapsing back to poverty that thinkers have brought out, saying that because of this out-of-pocket expenses on healthcare, many families that had managed to cross the poverty line have actually gone back into poverty because their hard-earned resources are being spent on healthcare. I hope I have answered the question.
Yes, thank you. And Dr. Sudeshna, did you want to add
Can
something?
I add something? Like we can, as I was talking about other countries, we can emulate what Spain did. Spain, after post-COVID, suddenly Spain nationalized entire healthcare. So I mean, the cases are rising in India. We are going to see a more difficult time. So we may need to take that step because it is the common complaint everywhere that private hospitals either denying patients or they're charging prohibitively. So to curb this situation, Spain has nationalized the healthcare in the post-COVID, during the COVID time. So that could be an option maybe, the days to come. We may need to adopt that. Thank you.
Thank you for adding that, Dr. Sudeshna. And as a follow-up question, you mentioned that we're learning a lot in this time in order to better prepare for the future. But the reality in India and around the world is that we are not past the COVID-19 epidemic. In fact, we're still in it right now. Are there steps that the Indian government can take right now to lessen the disproportionate impact on marginalized communities?
Well, I would say yes. We cannot. I think use the word post-COVID because this is an ongoing kind of a pandemic situation. But it's also not right to sit and wait for the COVID to pass away to take any action. So what I think is that, as I already mentioned, the policies of the Indian state or even civil society organizations or individuals that are planning to take some action, that are planning to adopt what I call a proactive approach, should think of 3 phases of policy planning action. One is short term, immediate, what needs to be done right away. And that is why I said that it cannot be at the macro level. It has to be at the micro level because the needs and priorities of different groups of people are different in this society and elsewhere also. So short term, middle term, long term. So this has to be estimated, and we need specific data, as we have been saying, disaggregated data based on gender, based on physical conditions, based on occupation, based on location in particular, migrant groups, etc. And also we need to have studies on what's happening to people who have gone back to their homelands, if I may use that word. You see, there is this big program here in India called the MGNREGA, Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, where you need to have job cards. Now, one study has shown very recently that for most of the migrants who have gone back, only about 6% have job cards, others don't have. So I think the state has to strengthen existing policies by taking locally relevant action. This is my feeling.
Thank you, Dr. Indira. Dr. Sudeshna, I wanted to ask you, this is something you have both talked about, the importance of disaggregating data. And I was wondering if you could share with us what it would look like to collect data that is disaggregated for these various marginalized groups, and how important it is to profile the actual experiences of members of these groups through micro-studies.
So on the first, we must accept that we are a very data poor country. Even in the most of the schemes also, like when we do some evaluation scheme for the government also, we found that even the gender disaggregated data is a very difficult to find. Like recently I was doing one evaluation study where the scheme wanted to give a special emphasis. It's a skill-based scheme that which talks about empowering the rural youth. And there was an emphasis on the transgender community that they should be given a priority. But we could not trace a single through the data because data entry has not happened in that way. So it is not only now census, as to a great extent, they are trying to be inclusive, gender inclusive, caste inclusive, or other disability and all they're collecting. but all the government, right from the, you can say that village level, because the government is the generator of the huge amount of data. So that has to be disaggregated, because they just mention them as a beneficiary. So they don't try to locate the beneficiary, who they are, what are their caste, what are their disabilities, what are the challenges they are facing. And we need, because when we look into these groups, we see that their challenges are manifold. And many a times, simply through the quantitative methods, we cannot understand where they are located. So we need more qualitative micro studies where the academics can play a significant role. So we also have to more work with such communities so that we can bring out more their, specific problems. Just by studying at the available data, we really cannot dwell on what the actual challenges they're going through. So we need more qualitative micro studies to support the state generated data. So that's what we are trying to see, that disaggregated form of data we need more. Thank you.
Thank you for that. We only have a couple of minutes left before we conclude. Are there any final thoughts, Dr. Indira or Dr. Sudeshna, you would like to share?
Well, we thank you for this opportunity, and there's a lot that can be said, but we have just brought in a few key points. And the only other thing that I would like to stress is that people in comfort zones, I always use this word, who have not faced the impact of the pandemic in a way that the marginalized, the vulnerable, excluded groups have faced, must think more and be ready to share whatever they have, because I've been stressing on this whenever I'm talking on this. And as somebody from the academic community, I think that whatever knowledge we may have, or whatever we can do by, as Sudeshna said, working in our own small neighborhoods, in our own small networks, building experiences of people, lived in experiences, as I call it, and share it. And the state also on its part must be ready to, to take into consideration the experiences of those who actually know the ground realities. That's all what I've got to say.
Thank you both, Dr. Indira and Dr. Sudeshna, for sharing so much with us today. I personally learned a lot, and I feel like I have a lot of more information that I would like to dive into with you. If we had more time, there's a lot we could discuss. Before we sign off for today, I'd like to tell all of our viewers about opportunities for faculty, research scholars, and professionals to visit the US on Fulbright fellowships administered by the United States India Educational Foundation, the Fulbright Narrow Academic and Professional Excellence Fellowships, and the Fulbright Narrow Postdoctoral Fellowships are still open for applications for 2021 to 22. For more details, you can visit their website at www.usief.org.in. Thank you again for joining us today, and please follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep yourself updated on our upcoming events. Once again, I want to thank Dr. Indira and Dr. Sudeshna for taking the time to share with us so much about this important topic of marginalization and thinking about how COVID-19 has impacted the most vulnerable among us and what we can do going forward. Thank you and goodbye.